There we go. Right, welcome, Paul. For those of you who don't know Paul, he gave a lecture, it was some time ago now, 13th of April for the Friends of Rutland County Museum and Oakham Castle, and he kindly offered to revisit this talk for recording for members of the public as well. So Paul, I think there's nothing else to say that please go ahead and deliver your talk and I'll see you at the end.
Okay, thanks very much. So this is a talk that I gave at Rutland County Museum to the Friends of the Museum on the 13th of April. So we're going to talk a little bit about the project that I'm involved in, which is the Oakham Canal Green Corridor project, and a little bit about the history of the Oakham Canal. So kind of a talk in four parts, really. History of the canal, the Green Corridor project. I'm the project manager for that project. What we've been up to as an organisation to date, and what next, including the thorny subject of restoration, which I get asked about all of the time. So a little bit of canal history then. So before we had canals, we moved things around the countryside with pack horse trains, and you can probably see a picture in the left-hand corner there of a typical pack horse train. So lots of horses with wicker baskets and moving things around. Then in the mid-1700s, along comes the Industrial Revolution. We invent steam engines and we need to get coal into manufacturing centres. And we also then need to export the manufactured goods around the countryside, either to towns or for export. So in the early 1760s, the Duke of Bridgewater owned a coal mine near Worsley in Manchester, and he engaged a young engineer called James Brindley, who'd done some work for him on water mills, to conceive the idea of building a waterway from his coal mines in Worsley out to Manchester. And this here canal was called the Bridgewater Canal. Mr. Brindley engineered that, and in 1761 it opened. Now that was deemed to be the first canal of the modern era. There were, however, earlier canals in this country. The Foss Dyke out near Lincoln was built by the Romans, and there is also a canal, it's actually a navigation, I'll explain more about that in a second, at Stamford, connecting the town out to Maud's Market Deeping. That was actually conceived in the reign of Elizabeth I, and was opened in 1670. So there were earlier canals in this country, but 1761 is the one that really started the canal mania. And as you can see on the slide here, between 1760 and 1830 is when most of the canals in this country were built. Now, all canals were privately financed. They required an act of parliament to get them made. They still do today. If you want to build a railway or a canal, you need something called a Transport and Works Act. And obviously, to get your canal built, you require the support of the landowners and MPs. Sometimes they were one in the same. There was, of course, some opposition to canals, particularly in relation to the watermill owners who thought that these new canals would steal all the water. And there was obviously some opposition from landowners who may or may not want canals going through their lovely landed gentry estates. So you can see on the plan that I got here, the canals and waterways of the East Midlands. So at the top, in the top left-hand corner, you'll see the River Trent. Now, the River Trent was always navigable from the estuary all the way out to Nottingham. The River Soar, which you can probably see on the left-hand side, running down towards Loughborough, was sometimes navigable down towards Loughborough. The River Soar tends to flood quite a bit, and it dries up quite a bit in the summer. There are two things on this plan, canals and navigations. So you'll see, for example, in the middle, Melton Mowbray Navigation and Oakham Canal. So a navigation is a waterway that already existed, i.e. a river, that was made navigable, either by installing locks where there were weirs or straightening or widening various sections of rivers. A canal, on the other hand, is a brand new cut in the landscape, so no waterway existed. So a lot of these navigations and canal schemes, particularly making the River Soar navigable from Loughborough down to Leicester, the Melton Mowbray navigation, and the Oakham Canal were all coming about at the same sort of time. One and the same engineer was appointed to look at all of these projects, and that was a guy called William Jessup. Now, he was quite busy doing other things, including the Grantham Canal, so he delegated the job of doing surveys to a guy called Robert Whitworth. Several schemes were proposed and rejected, and there were lots of interdependencies here. So obviously, to get boats to Oakham, you first need to get boats to Melton. And to get boats to Melton, you firstly have to make the River Soar navigable from Loughborough down to Syston. So all of these schemes were proposed by different people. They all had the same engineers, but they were rejected variously for various different reasons. And it wasn't until 1791 that the Melton Mowbray Navigation Act was passed. So that allowed the building effectively, or the making navigable, of the River Reek from Syston towards Melton. And quite quickly afterwards, in 1793, the Oakham Canal Act was passed. Now, to get landowner support, I said to you that we needed some to appease landowners, and there were some special provisions written into the Oakham Canal Act. Firstly, the Earl of Winchelsea, who owned a lot of the land around Oakham, he said, yeah, I will approve this here building of canal, subject to me getting 2p a tonne on all of the coal coming into Oakham. Also, Lord Harborough, who owned most of the land around Stapleford Park, he said he would approve it, but only if no works were to take place on his land until the whole of the rest of the canal was complete. So obviously he was thinking that this might never happen. Now, the Melton Mowbray Navigation Company and the Oakham Canal Company shared the same engineers. As I said, they shared the same design effectively through Robert Whitworth, but they shared the same engineers. A guy called Christopher Staveley Jr. was appointed as engineer on both projects. So the Oakham Canal Act specified how much money could be raised to build the Oakham Canal. So £56,000 was to be raised, and that was due to be raised by the issuing of 560 £100 shares. As far as we know, 545 shares were actually issued. And unlike a share today where you buy the full value of it, shares were called up, or the value of the share was called up in £5 units. So we might ask you for £5 this month and £20 next month and so on. And that allowed cash flow to come into the canal company to enable them to build the canal. So a few facts for you then. The canal took 8 years to build, we think employing around 120 men. It cost £68,000, which is about £100 million in today's money. It's 15.5 miles long, and it falls from 350 feet down to 250 feet at Melton. So if you can remember, Oakham is at the top of a hill and Melton is around 100 foot lower down. So to get the water down the hill, it required 19 broad locks. They were wide locks to take broad barges. And the canal opened in stages, with the Oakham end taking 6 months to fill up. And that should have been a little bit of a warning to what was to come. And eventually the canal was what was described in the press as much fanfare on the 16th of December 1802. The picture that you can see on the left is in Ashwell Road, and this is what was the former Boat Inn in Oakham. It was adjacent to the wharf, and I'll talk more about the wharf a little later on. Until the house was modernised, the old picture was taken in the 60s, I believe. There was actually a serving hatch in the side wall where boatmen could come and get their beer without going into the premises. Okay, the picture that you can see here is of the old canal basin in Melton Mowbray. It's broadly where the railway bridge goes across the railway into town, and I think most people would recognise the view down the main street there. The other Boat Inn still exists. It's just on the right-hand corner of the picture. And the bridge that you can see on the far right is the first bridge on the Oakham Canal. So the two boat inns were one at each end of the canal. The boat inn that still exists in Melton, it's a bit of a drinker's boozer, I have to say, but there is some canal memorabilia on the wall if you want to go and have a look. So this canal basin was filled in after the canal closed, or after the Melton Mowbray navigation closed, so somewhere in the late 1800s, we believe. So there were a few problems in building the Oakham Canal. First of all, in 1795, Christopher Staveley Jr. was given his marching orders by the Melton Mowbray Navigation Company, and he was also sacked by the Oakham Canal Company, and we don't know the reason for that. It was 2 years before the Canal Company found a replacement, and they engaged a guy called William Dunn of Sheffield. As far as we know, he had no previous canal building experience. The second problem was that by 1798, the shares were fully called up. We've been to you for your £100, and unfortunately the job wasn't finished. So workers were laid off and several attempts were made to try and raise additional funds. That proved unsuccessful, and the Canal Company were forced to go back to Parliament for another act to raise more money. So the revised act allowed a further £30,000 to be raised, and that was to be done by asking all of the original shareholders for another £30. That may seem a bit strange today, but that's how things were. And the deal was, if you didn't pay the extra £30, then you would forfeit your original share. And the records show that 18 of the shares were actually forfeit. I'll come back to the picture that you can see here of Oakham Wharf because it will make more sense in a minute. But just to talk a little bit about the operation of the canal. So the cargoes that were coming into Oakham were coal and building materials, and the cargoes that were going out were agricultural produce. Most of the brick buildings in Oakham occur after the coming of the canal because it was simply very difficult to get enough coal to make bricks into Oakham until the canal came. So by the 1840s, 25,000 tonnes of cargo were coming into Oakham every year, and that really saw quite a large population increase in Oakham. So in 1801, it was 1,630 people, and by 1841, it was 2,726. So I've spoken to you about the boats in. A couple of other things from the records. We know that a guy called Charles Judd, he used to work the weighing machine at Oakham Wharf, and he is reported to have absconded with £2.7 and 6, and nobody saw him again. And in 1838, John Hinman, who was the wharfinger at Oakham, and that's the wharf manager, he was dismissed that year, again for reasons unknown. And the records show that he died just 2 years later as a resident at the Boat Inn. So the supposition is that he may have turned to drink. I'll talk to you about the missing reservoir in a second, and bear in mind, as I said, that Oakham is about 350 feet up a hill. But water was the canal's problem, and in 1822, 25 and 26, the Oakham Canal suffered from a lack of water, and it was very difficult and sometimes impossible to get boats to Oakham. So several schemes were proposed, including the engagement of Thomas Telford, engineer, to look at ways that water could be ducted under the town from the River Gwash, which is on the other side of the town from where the canal is. Unfortunately, those schemes didn't work and problems persisted. So the picture that you can see here is Robert Whitworth's original drawing of the proposed Oakham Canal. You can see that it runs through Ashwell at the top, down to Oakham, and you'll see that the kind of reddy, dark coloured line actually goes straight through the town and out the other side towards Eggleton. Interestingly, the original scheme that was proposed was to link Melton Mowbray out to Stamford and to the east coast. That didn't get approved, and the canal ended up terminating in Oakham. But you can see quite clearly, and I've highlighted it here, that somewhere around where the Ashwell Garden Centre is now, a reservoir was proposed. There are some earthworks there, but as far as we know, this reservoir was never completed. And if you can imagine, as I said, being 350 feet up a hill, every time you use one of the 19 locks, around 56,000 gallons of water disappears down a hill towards Melton. So you have to keep water coming in at the uphill end. And as you probably know, there aren't too many rivers around Oakham that are going to be able to supply that much water. So this reservoir was perhaps vitally important. And you'll see, suffering from a lack of water for those years, something probably needed to have been done sooner. I showed you the picture of Oakham Wharf, and here it is now. You'll see the canal at the bottom of the screen runs from left to right, Originally, it just terminated in a small T-junction, but was later extended into the building that you see in the centre called Wharf. Now, you probably don't recognise where this is, so I'm going to show you a picture which is going to be overlaid on the top of this in a minute. So this is the Oakham school grounds. You've got Ashwell Road at the top. In the top right-hand corner, you've got what was the Odd House public house. Roughly in the centre of the screen, you've got the Queen Elizabeth Theatre. Just down in the bottom left-hand corner, you've got a line of trees. That's actually the water garden in Oakham School, which was at one time part of the canal. So I'll overlay the picture I showed you of the wharf on top of this one, and you'll see it makes a little bit more sense. The wharf building eventually became the Queen Elizabeth Theatre. It's got a distinctive curved corner, and if you look in the orchestra pit of the Queen Elizabeth Theatre, you'll find some of the original stone copings from when it was the wharf. That allowed goods to just be transported straight into the wharf building, offloaded in the dry, and then stored out in the yard somewhere. Okay. It was a good surveyor, as you can see, because the one drawing overlays quite nicely on the modern landscape, and you'll see that the old Odd House public house on the corner fits very nicely with the stabling at the rear, which was used for stabling the horses which would draw the barges into town. So the sad tale of the ending of the canal, really, but before that, some of the challenges. So in 1844, the canal was shut for 5 months. Boats couldn't get to Oakham due to a lack of water. And that was very bad timing, because on the 23rd of October that year, a public meeting was called by the Midland Counties Railway, who wanted to build a railway between Peterborough and Syston, coming through Stamford, Oakham, and Melton, Mowbray and Leicester. So Lord Harborough, who you remember didn't really want the canal in the first place, he came to the meeting and he objected to the whole idea, and he made a proclamation that no railway surveyors would be allowed on his land. So on the second public meeting was called for the 13th of November, where this was going to be discussed further. But on the 12th of November, some surveyors appear in Stapleford Park. Now, they come down the canal towpath to avoid any notion that they may be trespassing on Lord Harborough's land. The towpath was company land. And Lord Harborough's gamekeeper spotted these surveyors, a guy called Mr. Todd, and he stopped them at gunpoint, effectively, and said that they were trespassing. He rounded them up, put them in a cart, and took them off to the nearest Justice of the Peace. Now, unfortunately, the Justice of the Peace wasn't in, so Mr. Todd upended the cart, threw the railway surveyors on the ground, which occasioned the railway company to make a claim for assault against Lord Harborough's men. So on the 14th of November, this time the railway surveyors come pulled up, for want of a better word, with prize fighters from Nottingham, and came with 30 to 40 men. Lord Harborough wasn't stupid, he was expecting some trouble, so he also produced a lot of men from the estate, and effectively a pitched battle took place at a place called Saxby Bridge. This eventually ended in retreat on both sides. The court hearing was set for the first claim of assault on the 19th of November, and that was to be that. But on the 16th of November, this time 100 men arrive from the railway company, and further battles take place with Lord Harborough and his men from the estate. This gets everybody nowhere, and eventually all of this ends up in the Leicester Assizes with fines and imprisonments on both sides. So what happened to the canal? Well, by January 1845, effectively there was a purchase agreement in place. In June of that year, the Syston and Peterborough Railway had an act passed for its construction. And by 1846, a formal agreement was in place to sell the canal company to the railway. As far as we know, and I only found this out recently, this was the first time that a canal company had sold to a railway company. So the deal was that £26,000 would be paid, and there would be £240 railway shares. Well, if you remember, 50 years before this, approximately, it cost 56,000 and some to build the canal, so it wasn't a sweet deal. So by July 1846, that act was passed. October 1847, the sale was completed. And by March 1848, just 3 years after the act was passed, the railway opens for goods traffic. And that's really what the railway company wanted. They wanted the traffic. And by 1849, the land and assets have been sold. All the lock chambers have been demolished. The picture I show you is actually from the Melton Mowbray navigation of a lock chamber in disrepair. But none of the 19 lock chambers on the Oakham Canal exist. There is one surviving bridge, and pretty much all of the infrastructure was dismantled and the land returned to private ownership. Did anybody make any money? Good question. If you were a shareholder, we'd come to you, if you remember, for £130. It took a long time to get your dividends. The first dividend was £2, was paid quite a long time after the canal opened in 1802. And if you totaled up all the dividends that you got over the 50 years, you got £87 back for your £130 share. So who made money here? Carters, people who carted stuff from the villages to the canal wharves. If you think about where the canal runs, Cottesmore, the canal is at the bottom of the hill, the village at the top. Market Overton is exactly the same. And the villages around Freeby and Brentingby are all up the hill. So the wharf owners made some money. Lord Harborough, interestingly, owned, we think, around 3 wharves in Stapleford Park. So you will probably understand why he was a bit anti this canal disappearing, because he was making some money from it. The wharf which still exists, or the wharf buildings which still exist down the hill at Market Overton, called the Old Wharf, were owned by the Bennett family. They were privately owned. Cottesmore Wharf, which is now Oakham School, or Oakham School grounds, was owned by the Canal Company. And boat operators made some money. They got paid when you delivered the goods and not before. So they made some money. The Canal Company itself only had 1 boat. We don't know why, so they weren't making money out of that. And obviously the Canal Company itself charged tolls for what was carried on the canals. And the records show that there were some significant expenses to be taken from the £26,000 by the Oakham Canal Company in closing the canal. Yeah, probably. So you as the shareholder didn't make any money, I'm afraid. So let me tell you about us, really, the Green Corridor project. So we're here, I guess, to love the Oakham Canal, or the bits that we can get to. We want to engage with the local community to develop and maintain the bits of the canal as a leisure corridor. We certainly want to preserve it as a heritage asset. As we said, 120 blokes, took 8 years to build it. We want to provide some interpretation around that as well, and we've made some strides to do that. And we want to enhance and maintain the environment, improve the footpaths for public access, and improving the habitats and diversity of species along the canal corridor. So this is the Oakham Canal in the red there. The bit that we're looking at, our current operating area, is really between the town and the Enterprise Park, just beyond the Enterprise Park. We do have plans to go a bit further, but we've got enough on our plate at the minute. So the bit we're looking at is kind of in 6 sections, really. So the first section that we've described here at the bottom of the screen is where the Oakham Canal Wharf used to be. Clearly that's Oakham School. We don't really want to have public access into Oakham School, and neither do they. So we're not really focusing on that. But clearly there's a lot of heritage around the buildings that still remain. Section 2 is the bit of the canal line that extends north from Oakham School, behind Barmstadt Drive and behind the allotments. Sadly, there is no public access there, and the land where the canal used to be, it's filled in, tapers to a bit of a dead end. But there is a bit of a canal in the Springfield estate, just inside the bypass, and that's really where our project begins. We've then got a section of canal in 2 different bits of repair, really. We've got a bit that's boggy and muddy just north of the bypass in section 4 there. And then we've got a bit where the canal is filled in, which is just a hedgerow. And then we've got 2 bits of canal that are in water, section 5 and section 6, where we have a public footpath running down the eastern side and some informal paths, as they were, running down the western side. Now, our mission really at the moment is to join all these bits up and maintain all these bits, which are in various bits of ownership, using local public volunteers for the benefit of the public, because it's a lovely green space. So how did we get to this? Well, in 2014, I did some walking up and down the canal, and in some places it was not very walkable, very muddy, slippery, overgrown. Because it's a public footpath in places, I started speaking to the county council and said, wouldn't it be lovely if somebody maintained all of this? And they more or less went, yeah, go on then. So I struggled, I guess, over the next couple of years to gather information about who the landowners were, started talking to the stakeholders like the Oakham Angling Society. And at the time I was working largely overseas on the Rio Olympics and World Cup projects and things like that. So it wasn't until 2017 that I came up with this idea of a green corridor concept, which I started touting about to people. And between then and 2019, we got involved with those stakeholders and an organisation called the Sustainable Land Trust, who helped us out on the ecological side. And it kind of became clear, really, that we needed to demonstrate whether there was public support for the project. So in February 2019, I mail-shotted, hand-delivered letters to around 600 homes on the north side of Oakham, arranged a church hall meeting. I was asked how many people would come, and I went, about 10 probably. And I was surprised that 100 people turned up, and there were very few dissenting voices for this project. And in October 2020, we decided to set ourselves up as a proper charity where we could actually do some stuff. The first thing that we did a deal with the trustees of St John and St Anne, who own some of the land to the west of the canal, and made the informal paths formal. We are now maintaining them and ensuring people walking on it. So we've now got a kind of circular walk on the north end of the canal. And in November 2021, we started physical restoration work, and I'll show you some of the things we've been doing. So who we've been working with, on the top line are people who've given us some money. Trivandi, who are a company I used to work for, gave us £5,000 from activities, really fundraising from their staff. Severn Trent have recently given us £3,500. So next time you look at your water bill, you can go, oh, I know it's a bit expensive, but they've helped out the canal project. Rutland County Council have given us a grant, so have Oakham Town Council. We've had some money from the Rutland Lions, and we're supported by the Oakham Morris Men. We work with Oakham School, the Melton and Oakham Waterway Society, the Angling Society. Tarmac have given us some support. They're a county council contractor, and they built a bridge for us. Obviously, St John and St Anne, who we did a deal with from the land ownership point of view. And Alicia Kearns, MP, seems to love us, and she's put some nice things out and about with us. And down the bottom here, you'll see some of the ecological partners that we're working with, including the Wildlife Trust, Root and Branch Out, Ecology Resources, and the Natural History Society. Okay, so this is what the north end of the public footpath used to look like back in the day. A muddy, slippery mess, very narrow, very overgrown. And we set to work with some grants. It's a 410-metre path. We levelled it by hand. We shoveled and moved 50 tonnes of aggregate. Unfortunately, we couldn't use any machinery on this path because of the nature of where it is. And we think we moved about 1,000 barrow loads of material, one barrow at a time. Because we dumped the material at one end, the first journey was 40 metres and our last journey was 820 metres. It took us 3 months to do that, and you can see the effects on that path. If you go down there today, it looks completely different. It looks very much like we've never been there. but nonetheless, there is a hard surface path now where there was a slippery, muddy mess. Okay, we also had an issue with some steps in the left-hand picture on the top row, some rickety steps. We constructed some brand new ones. They were only meant to be temporary, but they turned out to be much better than the other steps, which were going to be very difficult for us to replace. And again, on the bottom row, you'll see a picture of one of the bridges, and we have built this lovely bridge. I say we built it, Tarmac built it, we provided the material. But that gave us an idea, and I'll show you in a second. Again, on the top row, you'll see another bridge across the dam, which holds some water back. And based on the fact that we saw Mr. Tarmac building a bridge, we thought we could do that. So we built that second bridge that you can see there with the satisfied customers on it. And also, as we were doing some of these works, a couple of guys said to us, could you build some benches? And we really said, we haven't got the money for that. So they gave us £100 between them, and with that we built 3 new benches down the path. On the western banks, we've been deploying some bark chippings to make the path more walkable in the winter. Sadly, most of those have disappeared now, but it did make the path more walkable. We might be doing that again next winter. And on the angling section, so this is the section south of Burley Road, where the fishermen fish. Again, we had rather a slippery, muddy mess in places, and with our most recent series of grants, we've again put a new hard surface path down there. And we did that about 3 months ago, and again, nature is taking it over, which is really nice, and it's looking very natural now. Some of our lovely volunteers, you can see in the bottom left, Mr. Tarmac, who was very proud of his bridge that he built. Some guys from Trevandi in the top left, and in the middle on the upper row, and the Morris men down the bottom. And all in all, we've been very lucky to get a lot of community support for the project. We've also been on the telly. We've been in Will's Walks. I was on a recent episode of Escape to the Country. I think it's been repeated 3 times. Every time it's repeated, they say, "Oh, Paul, you were on the telly." Yeah, it was done. It was recorded during COVID times. So it looks like I'm standing in the tree, and I am, so, to keep everybody's distance. And you can see there me with Alicia, who came to do a kind of, I see you're doing some work type thing. So we've been in the press, and we've got some good publicity out of all of that. So what are we going to do next? We're making an effort to continue to gain some more land north of the bypass to make the public footpath, which is currently not lined up with the canal, lined up with the canal. We want to retain the Oakham Canal as green space. There's very little green space in Oakham. A lot of it's owned by Oakham School or the rugby club or is the showground. And you'll see, if you've not walked it, the canal corridor offers a lot of different habitats in a very short space. We want to work more with local conservation organisations, and particularly younger age groups, try and get those involved. We're improving the diversity along the canal corridor. We do have plans for taking our project further north out towards Rocks by Rail if we can. So far, we've been very lucky at gaining funding. We've got a couple of big projects which we've received funding for, which I can't tell you about at the minute, but you can look us up on the website. So we're doing very well so far, but we always need public support. So a little bit about biodiversity. We've got some interesting things. The willow emerald damselfly, which was first discovered in Rutland in 2019. We have it in Alder, and that's the first time apparently in Rutland. We have water voles. You can see a picture in the bottom middle there. And we've got at least 5 different species of bats, badgers, various foxes and other things, and we want to keep that diversity going. So restoration, my last little piece, I guess. I often get asked about, when can we get the canal restored? Well, I can tell you it's very, very unlikely to happen. It's not something that we're driving for. To get boats back to Oakham, you first have to get boats to Melton. There are some significant problems with that. Firstly, you have to reinstate the level of water that was in the River Reek back in the day. The River Reek used to flood, and a lot of the villages, Frisbee and Melton indeed, used to flood in the winter. So a few years back, the Environment Agency built a dam at Brentingby to hold excess water back in the fields on the eastern side of Melton. And I think it's very unlikely that they will want to let more water into the River Reek than is in it today. Secondly, you've got to restore at least 12 lock chambers, and you've got about the same number of miles, i.e. 12 miles of river to dredge and widen and reinstate. So I think that's very difficult. And even if you manage to do that, you've then got the challenge of getting boats to Oakham. Now that is a significantly more difficult job because all of the canal land is back in private ownership. So effectively you're starting again with purchasing the land, seeking permission. Now you've got 19 locks to reinstate. You've got some channels to dig. You've got new channels to dig because in part the railway line is built on the canal. And that's the same in the middle of Melton, where the pet food factory is now. It's where the canal used to run into Melton. And if you could manage to do that, you've still got the problem that you've got to find water at the Oakham end, which was always its problem in the first place. And then finally, if you manage to do all of that, where's the commercial imperative to do it? Taking boats to Oakham, which is a dead end down best part of 30 miles of canal, who is going to pay for that? Because the Canal and River Trust, who maintain our canal network, are only funded for the canal network that they already have. So it would all need to be privately funded and privately maintained. So that is a significantly difficult job and could only happen if you got boats to Melton. And I think neither of those are likely at all. But you could imagine, couldn't you? On the field north of the bypass, you could build a big marina in there with shops and bars and boats, and it'd be lovely. But really in your dreams, I think. So that's why I don't think restoration will ever happen. It's not something we're championing, and maintaining this lovely green space is what we're about. So that's us really. We're the Oakham Canal Green Corridor Project. You can look us up on the web address you see there, oakhamcanal.org. We've got Facebook pages as well. If you want to come and help us, we have regular work parties. If you want to support us financially, you can do that too. We have a donation button. But otherwise, that's me really.
Thank you so much. It's really difficult to give a talk without an audience, but I was smiling and laughing and nodding in all the right places. So I really appreciate that. And thank you for giving the talk.
No problem.